Good evening, all of you. Welcome, all of you here present live, and welcome also to the people following us online. My name is Johan Eijkmans, and I'm co-chairing this Lias Metaforum working group on societal aspects of climate change. And in this in our Metaforum working group, we decided to focus on three topics. One of them was the coal phase out, a second one was behavioral change for the environment, and a third one is on the role of cities. And tonight I'm very happy that we can have this workshop concluded with a very nice talk that will be introduced later by my colleague. But it's very clear that cities play a very important role in the future of climate change, both as some say as some of the cause of climate change, but also probably in their role as some victim of climate change. So that is what we are going to do tonight. This is the third and the last workshop that we have in this Lias Metaforum working group, but I'm now handing over to my colleague Hilde Heynen, who will introduce the speakers of tonight.
Thank you for this introduction. So my name is Hilde Heynen. I'm one of the members of this Metaforum Lias working group, and my field is architecture and urbanism. And I'm happy to introduce to you the main speaker of tonight, together with the two respondents. First, Lindsay Bremner. She is one of the fellows of the Lias fellows, so one of the people invited by the Leuven Institute of Advanced Study to work with the Leuven-based group on these aspects of climate change, cities and climate change. Lindsay Bremner is Professor of Architecture and Director of Research in the School of Architecture and Cities at the University of Westminster. She has had an ERC starting grant on monsoon assemblages, and I think that what she will present us tonight will draw on the research she did with that grant. Previously, she has been wide experience. She was a professor of architecture and chair in the Tyler School of Art at Temple University in Philadelphia, and before that, chair of architecture at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She also has experience as a practicing architect and has lectured and published widely. Let me leave it at that. You will hear from Lindsay soon. We also have two respondents tonight, and I think for a change it's a completely female lineup today, which is why I thought it was appropriate to ask Johan to introduce the whole thing, in order to provide a bit of diversity, you know. Our first respondent is another Lias fellow, Professor Luciana Travassos, sitting next to me. She has degrees in architecture and urbanism from the University of São Paulo, and also a PhD in environmental science from the same university. She has been active as an advisor to the Municipal Secretariat of Urban Development of São Paulo, and is currently a professor at the, let me see here, the Federal University of ABC based in São Paulo, and also she has been teaching in other universities and other places. Her main work, body of work, is on regional planning in the macro-metropolitan region of São Paulo, and especially on water infrastructure and on just urbanism, just transition. That's how we will frame it. And then lastly, there is Kelly Shannon. She is a colleague in the Department of Architecture, teaching urbanism there, and she is the program director of the Master of Human Settlements and the Master of Urbanism, Landscape and Planning, that's at the Faculty of Engineering Science here in Leuven. She also has a wide international experience, Her first degree is from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Later on, she attended the Berlage Institute. Her PhD is from Leuven, but she also has been teaching in Colorado, Denver at Harvard University, the University of Southern California. Kelly, it's a lot. Where is Kelly? It's a lot. Peking University, Oslo School of Architecture and Design, among others, but now she's safely back in Leuven, I can say. Without further ado, there is Kelly, sorry, I lost you for a moment. I ask Lindsay Bremner to take the floor.
Thank you, Hilda. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I must say, this is the first in-person lecture I've given since before COVID, and it feels quite nerve-wracking. I'm not used to it, so we'll see how it goes. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I've so enjoyed the discussions over the last 2 days. They've been really stimulating, thought-provoking, and I hope to add something to that discussion this evening. Am I sitting okay? Right place? Good. Okay, so I'm going to try through this lecture to really address the questions that Hilda asked us to consider over the last 2 days and put those I'm going to try and answer them in an indirect way. But these really are the central questions that I'm trying to add something to. How do cities relate to climate change, and how can urban planning play a role in mitigation, adaptation, and I've added something, and system change. Some of you will be familiar with my work on Johannesburg in the 1990s and early 2000s, when I and my students tracked the transition of the city from an apartheid city to a post-apartheid metropolis, focusing on the tactical ways that people were remaking urban space in the gaps left by the demise of apartheid planning. At the time, my work drew on geographical theory, splintering urbanisms, insurgent urbanisms, and so on, to theorize these developments. But I still approached the urban as an exclusively societal category. Only towards the end of my work on Johannesburg did I begin to think about the city as shaped by wider geological and hydrological agencies. These are some interesting maps. That's the map of the Witwatersrand gold fields at the top, where Johannesburg is located, which I started discovering was formed by the alluvial kind of flows into an ancient sea. And then that diagram was a real wake-up call for me, because Johannesburg is situated on a watershed where streams to the north run to the Indian Ocean and streams to the south run to the Atlantic Ocean. So here you're sitting on a site which is both geologically watery and in fact is linked to the ocean through these rivers and their tributaries. And that was a real wake-up call for me, and really inaugurated the oceanic approach to urban research that I've pursued ever since. I left Johannesburg in 2005 when, prompted by an invitation to participate in the Rotterdam Architecture Biennale, I invented a research project I called Folded Ocean. If you fold a map of the Indian Ocean down the Maldives, you find certain cities map onto each other more or less along the equator, and the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, which kind of suggested that the ocean, was this symmetrical kind of space that drew these cities together into conversation with one another. Through this project, I investigated the ocean as an agent shaping and reshaping cities in and around the Indian Ocean. I and my students researched how human interactions with the ocean were being transformed by globalization and climate change. For instance, in Lamu in Kenya, a small island in the Bengal Delta, the Maldives, and I also looked into the disappearance of flight MH370 in the southern Indian Ocean and how that changed our conceptions of the Southern Ocean. Monsoon assemblages. A folded ocean made me aware of the significance of the monsoon to the Indian Ocean world. In 2015, I applied to the European Research Council for a project, as Hilde's mentioned, called Monsoon Assemblages, to investigate 3 cities around the Bay of Bengal, Chennai in Tamil Nadu, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Yangon in Myanmar, all 3 of which were undergoing rapid economic transformation and were increasingly at risk from monsoon-related climate change. I was fortunate enough to be awarded this grant, and the project finished last year. I'd like to spend the remaining time of this lecture discussing the project, how we approached it and what we learned from it, and then draw out some remarks in relation to the workshop we've been in the last 2 days based on what I present. Monsoon assemblages took issue with the idea, deeply embedded within climate science and the popular imaginary, that society and climate are separate, bounded domains stacked up against one another. This attitude was expressed by Bishop Desmond Tutu at COP20 in 2014 in Lima. We've forgotten about all these COPs in the past already. Bishop Tutu said, "We fought apartheid, now climate change is our global enemy." Such ideas are complicit with what Bruno Latour called the modern scientific constitution, a knowledge system grounded in binaries and the assumption of objective access to a measurable, externalized world. Like Latour, and this image, this painting of Newton by William Blake exemplifies this idea that nature's outside, climate's outside, and we can measure and understand it objectively. Like Latour, postmodern theorists took issue with this idea, but they argued that while there might be an external reality, human relations with it are constituted entirely through signs, language in particular, and that what is real for humans is sign systems. That this foreclosed access to the material world, except in the language of science, economics, or culture, Foucault's Life, Labor, and Language, through which external reality is brought into the realm of human intelligibility and mastered. Oh dear, the sound is working, I'm sorry, we'll have to switch it off. Counter to these 2 approaches, monsoon assemblages drew from feminist and science and technology scholarship to recognize the monsoon not only as an object of science and a discursive construct, but also a subject of world-making. We took it as a noteworthy actor in the world, not in a positive, human-centric way, but as an elusive, active, more than human other. We responded to Elizabeth Gross's call to think through rather than about the earth, and what it means to afford political power to the elemental forcefulness of the earth itself. At times nurturing, at times recalcitrant, at times overwhelming, the monsoon follows logics that have little, if anything, to do what humans make of it, think of it, or do with it. It is a restless material multiplicity, interacting within itself and the human and non-human bodies and practices that respond to and shape it from within in countless divergent and unpredictable ways. Our method of research, which we called Monsoon as Method, was a way of thinking with the monsoons a gentle materiality and with its ongoing transformative power as it interacted with human and non-human bodies and practices. That was supposed to be going. The monsoon is what Karen Barad calls, and this is a very long phrase, I'm afraid, an iterative process of space-time mattering across differences of humidity, pressure, temperature, and salinity, produced by the interactive energy exchanges between the sun and our spinning planets, oceans, airs, and continents. I should have stopped that. Sorry, I should be there. The monsoon is an atmospheric life of intensive self-articulating difference, producing what we humans apprehend as winds, clouds, rain, weather fronts, cyclones, and so forth. As it moves, the monsoon interacts with and rearranges and is rearranged by mountains and seas, soils and plants, human and non-human bodies and practices, engineered infrastructures, surfaces and spaces, by economics, politics, cultural rituals, everyday life, and the technologies and media through which these relations are constructed. Right. The word monsoon, from mausum in Arabic, means season. It was originally used by sailors in the Arabian Sea to refer to the seasonal reversal of winds, occurring at relatively fixed times each year, that made the earliest transoceanic trading systems in the world possible. This is a map that we drew of very, very early transoceanic trading systems, which were driven or made possible by these reversing systems of winds. This occurred, and still does, because the solar energy absorbed by land masses in the northern hemisphere in spring produced temperature differentials between land and sea, as the sea retains its winter cold for longer. On this side you have an image that we drew of the summer monsoon, which is when the winds flow from the cold ocean to the hot earth. And that is an image of the winter monsoon, when the Himalayas start to cool down and the ocean is still warmer because it retains its heat for longer, so the winds get pulled back by the warmer ocean and they move from the northeast, whereas the summer monsoon moves from the southwest. So you have this extraordinary exchange of temperature differentials over land and sea, which produces not only reversing winds, but reversing oceanic currents as well. But the monsoon is more than an annual meteorological cycle. For more than half the Earth's human population, literally, and a large proportion of its non-human population too, the monsoon is a way of being, a saturation of possibilities, an eco-rich commons, and a matter of life and death. It is registered by cultures, lifestyles, politics, and economics that revolve around its cycles and are disrupted by its ways. It is an embodied aesthetic, it is cultural ritual, it is fertile land, it is reproductive cycle, it is a political clock, and economic indicator. Cities in monsoonal regions are lively, more than human ecologies that are shaped by the monsoon's uncanny energies from within. They are seasonal, sometimes wet, sometimes dry places, darkened each year by towering rain-bearing clouds, driven by ferocious winds, inundated by torrential rains that seep, soak, spread, pool and flow, and then evaporate and dry out, blurring boundaries, as we heard by one of the PhD students today, between ground, water, and air, in continuous wet to dry, hot to hotter cycles. Such cities do not exist in relation to the monsoon. They are assembled within it. They cannot be climate-proofed against the monsoon and its vagaries. What an absurd idea, I think, for they are thrown together within it in intricate, knotted entanglements. If we are going to figure out, I think, what we're going to do about climate change and give meaning to the idea of climate justice, we have to put weather at the center of our approach to cities. British geographer Mike Hume, in a beautiful book called Weathered: Cultures of Climate, argues that climate is an idea. It's a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the world in which we live. Climate might be backed up by data, but it is essentially a way that humans interpret and make sense of weather over time, and the cultural ways of living through which they adapt to it. So climate and climate change are ideas that connect material and imaginative worlds in ways that create order and offer stability to human experience. The World Meteorological Society's definition of climate is a statistical description of averages and the variability of variables like temperature over time. Climate modelers see climate as a way of describing the state and dynamics of the planetary system. But Hume argues, these scientific descriptions do not do justice to the material and symbolic interactions between weather and cultures and perpetuate a nature-culture divide. As long as we can measure climate in numbers, it's something out there. Hume approaches climate not through statistics, which actually were only possible since the 17th century, and only since the 19th century has climate become based on standardized techniques of measurement. But Hume approaches climate through the ways that people experience weather and the knowledge systems, rituals, and practices they create to understand it and live in it. This is an image of a special food that is served in Tamil Nadu just before the monsoon starts. It's a millet-based porridge which you eat outside the temple in order to build your fortitude for the coming monsoon. So there are these cultural rituals that punctuate the annual cycle based on monsoonal cultures of responses to the monsoon. Sorry, I'm a bit slow there. Next. Sorry. In our work, the idea of assemblage became a tool for exploring the dynamics of monsoonal urbanism as multiple and lively human and more than human ecologies with weather, more than human entanglements with weather. The concept of assemblage, which we drew from Deleuze and Guattari, enabled us to distance our work from British historian Rhodes Murphy's construct, which some of you might know, of monsoon Asia in his book, very famous book called The History of Asia. For Murphy, monsoon Asia was a unit of study of Asia in which rainfall had produced population densities and cultures with common features. So it was this kind of defined geographic unit of study. But going with Deleuze and Guattari, unities are deceptions, designed to obscure rather than reveal the nature of reality. Along with other geographical units, such as the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa, monsoon Asia was a remnant of a European epistemological spatial structure that organizes knowledge of the world in rigid categories as they appear from the colonial center, reinforcing fantasies of otherness, power, dominance, and peripherality, which is why I take such exception to the idea of other parts of the world being peripheral to the center. I don't think there are centers and peripheries anymore. They're just it's a multi-central rhizomic world that we're living in. The monsoon in our method was not a signifier of otherness, but of a multi-positional method that moved from outside to inside, pushed the global positionality of science up against the situated knowledge of everyday experience, and changed the monsoon itself from being an object of study that we were looking at into a forceful subject of world-making. Okay, so much for the theory. Sorry, that was a lot of theory. In all three cities we worked in, Chennai, Dhaka, and Yangon, long-standing patterns of living with the monsoon were being disrupted by the relentless imperatives of neoliberal development. And today I'm just going to discuss one of those cities, Chennai, and kind of describe how this disruption was being played out. The neoliberalization of India's economy began in the 1990s, when the country faced an economic crisis of unmanageable external debt and double-digit inflation. A balance of payment loan from the IMF and a series of economic reforms to open India's market to international competitiveness was set in place, and I don't need to go into what those were, and in order to liberalize India's access to foreign capital. At the same time, IT was declared an engine of economic growth, and an overlapping system of national and state-level policies, laws, programs, incentives, and plans were put in place to realize this IT, internet technology, as the driver of economic growth. And Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, in southeast India, was one of the cities selected to become an IT hub, and it still is the third IT hub in India. Chennai lies on a flat coastal plain on the southwest coast of the Bay of Bengal, where the monsoon is erratic and unpredictable. The southwest monsoon, that rain-bearing monsoon from the southwest, largely passes it by, as it lies in the shadow of the Western Ghats. But when the monsoon turns and sweeps back across the Bay of Bengal, interactions between the cold winds and the hot sea can give rise to fierce tropical storms and cyclones. And that was a map that we drew of, maybe it's jumped on, of this famous cyclone in 2015, which resulted in the 2015 floods in Chennai. Or the same conditions can deny rain to Chennai at all for years on end, which is what resulted in the famous kind of droughts and famine in the late 19th century, which Mike Davis writes about in his book, Late Victorian Holocaust. Chennai received no rain at all for 3 years. This means that Chennai has, since its founding in 1634, suffered from water scarcity and precarity. Sometimes too much, sometimes too little, never just enough. Which meant that from the year 1850 onwards, like way before it was colonized, the societal response to this precarity was to build an infrastructure of shallow surface water tanks to retain and distribute monsoon rain and allow it to percolate into the aquifers. This is a map of the greater Tamil Nadu area, and all the grey and blue spots on it, the sort of acneed terrain, are these thousands of little surface water tanks that retain the monsoon rain as much as possible, because one never knows if one's not going to get it next year. This is an image of these tanks. They're not very beautiful, they're not very aesthetic. They literally are ways of holding water back. And some of them, however, were associated with temples, forming the kind of centers of traditional settlements. However, because these tanks are not permanent lakes, and that's the important thing about them, but seasonal water bodies whose wetness is on the one hand dank and on the other hand dynamic, they have, since the introduction of colonial town planning in India, this is a map that we drew we were trying to analyze how these tanks worked in the landscape. And the red lines are the tank bunds, the tank walls, and you can see how they were designed so that if one got too full, it would flow down to the next one. So it was this series of kind of extraordinary system of kind of linked tanks which would hold water back and then distribute it into the agricultural fields around it. However, since the 1920s, when colonial town planning was introduced to India, tanks were associated with pestilence and disease, and their eradication was promoted as advantageous for the urban economy. They were taking up space in the city, and for human health. This is one of the earliest town improvement systems for Chennai, which was called Madras at the time, and you can see that sort of banana-shaped thing in the top, what's this, left-hand corner, was a huge water tank, which a road was put across. It opened up development on the other side of the tank, and very soon the tank became a housing development. And this set in place a process which was then exemplified in the 1970s when the World Bank came to Madras, and the World Bank is a great friend of Tamil Nadu, and the World Bank proposed, and I've got an image of the latest kind of series, to remove the urban poor from the city and settle them in these water bodies on the periphery of the city. This is the latest huge housing scheme that's been built, which is actually in a floodplain. So there's this kind of social re-engineering that takes advantage of the fact that for most of the year, some years, these are dry spaces, but then when the rains come, they become water bodies. So this practice of building on water bodies has kind of really dramatically altered the city's relationship with rain. The rate of the disappearance of these water bodies accelerated when India embarked on its neoliberal development path in the 1990s. Through various policy-driven development mechanisms, and we've heard a lot about them over the last 2 days, industrial parks, special economic zones, and in particular, the creation of an IT corridor, which is that black line you can see running down from just south of the center of the city, right down a coastline, through very sensitive ecological wetlands and backwaters, created into an IT corridor as a linear development corridor, and various incentives put in place to attract IT development along this corridor. You got special development rights if you built office facilities for the information technology sector. Of course, this kind of brought a whole kind of thousands and thousands of new IT workers to this part of the city. Housing had to be built, schools had to be built, hospitals had to be built, shopping malls had to be built, and suddenly this very, very sensitive wetland landscape, which is called the Palikarnai Marsh, was encroached upon not by the urban poor, but by the developers. This is just a series of maps we drew of the kind of part of the inner city in 1900, 1954, and 2010, and all the brown shapes on the maps are the water bodies that were filled in, that existed as water before, and one can see they're almost entirely gone by 2010. At the same time, as neoliberal growth development dramatically increased the demand for what? For energy supply. the state built 2 new coal-powered power plants in another coastal creek, this time to the north of the city, which was always the poorer part of the city. It was called the Black City in the colonial period. So there were 2 new power stations built in this creek land, and a new port was built, which dramatically altered the coastline. First of all, just for the offloading of coal, but now this port now features as a major node in global supply chains. And this is the map that somebody else used earlier today. This is a map that we drew of Modi's new industrial corridors. One can see a corridor running from Chennai all the way up the east coast of India, right around to Bangladesh and Myanmar. But what we found so extraordinary about this drawing was it showed us how these new corridors followed almost exactly the lines of the colonial triangulation, which mapped India. So one has this colonial legacy within these contemporary development projects. That's just an aside. Okay, so Chennai has been dramatically transformed by these neoliberal growth-driven development strategies, which both dramatically increased Chennai's GDP, Chennai's affluence, Chennai's middle class, and its consumption-based lifestyles. It also decreased Chennai's monsoonal resilience and devalued Dalit ways of life. And the unprecedented floods of 2015 and water shortages of 3 years later, should I say, which unequally impacted the urban poor, were a direct consequence of turning wetlands into real estate, of economic demands for cheap energy, and of affluent lifestyles. These were not natural disasters, but disasters by design. I'm going to say a little bit now about research. As monsoon assemblages developed, we as Western researchers were acutely aware of the history of research as a colonial encounter, and of the extractive legacies and violence of the Western eye. And we were kind of perplexed by our complicity with this. Maori scholar Linda Tuhawi-Smith reminded us that research is one of the ways in which the underlying code of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism is both regulated and realized. For Western research turns places into field sites and people into objects of study. And I dare say we're all complicit with this, actually, any of us who work in other places. And it's something to really think about, I think. Colonized subjects are appropriate as raw material for knowledge production, denied any agency in their research processes, and their own forms of situated knowledge either appropriated or rendered irrelevant. And we had a wonderful discussion with Kelly and the PhD students in our workshop session today. I think this is precisely what you don't do here, but it's very general that this is the kind of research practice that people from Western institutions use. I think I have this is an extraordinary graph, actually drawn from the latest PCC research, and I just wanted to highlight this. The graph shows funding for climate research on Africa and the whole world. The blue line is the world. That's the line of funding for research on climate change in Africa. And the table at the side shows where research is done on Africa from. Okay? The United States, there are only 2 countries in Africa who get funding for climate research, and that's Kenya and South Africa. And this, to me, is one of the most damning tables in the latest IPCC reports, and kind of just illustrates the very serious problem we have of us Western researchers and how we devalue the kind of knowledge of the countries that we're researching. Our approach to these questions was informed by Donna Haraway's, and I was interested to hear that you also use Donna Haraway's proposition that all knowledge is partial and comes from somewhere. Acknowledging and naming where it is generated from in mental and physical space and who generated it is an act of political and epistemological responsibility. We cannot claim other people's knowledge for our own. It acknowledges that knowledge claims are claims on people's lives and on the life of the earth, and views positions of subjecthood and objecthood as irreversible. And that's how we try to conduct our research practice. Deleuze and Guattari call this thinking from the middle, not from a position of the outside or the on top or the below, but thinking from the middle, which I would like to illustrate by referring to anthropologist Hannah Knox's recent book, Thinking Like a Climate, which I've got the cover up here. I don't know if any of you know this book. The book is an ethnography of how the material dynamics of climate change were translated into the work of governing the city of Manchester in England over a 10-year period. It is also a reflection on how climate change began to weather the very foundations of Knox's own research practice. She realized she could no longer document and describe climate change from the outside, for it was not a condition from which she could extract herself. In a climate-changing world, she wrote, anthropology had no special privilege to remain the same. Our representations and our practices, too, will have to move with the carbon, the weather, and the computer models that carry them into the practices of human world-making and mold them into the cultural imagination. She recognized that she was complicit with what she was studying. For her, climate change became a contact zone of practices and ideas, in which anthropological reflections sat alongside and interacted with other epistemologies and practices. It wasn't above or below them, it was part of an interactive process of knowledge making. Her own visceral, embodied encounters with climate change also began to trouble her reliance on air travel. And she made the decision to embark on an experiment of doing anthropology without flying, and put the anthropological questions that air travel posed at the center of her practice. So her practice was transformed, both in how it operated and what it thought about, through this kind of acknowledgement that she was in the middle of what she was studying. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with a few, not quite conclude, nearly conclude. This is a semi-conclusion. In a similar way, monsoon assemblages brought about the realization that we as Western researchers could not document and describe the monsoon from the outside, for our lives were wrapped up in it. We were the beneficiaries of a colonial order that had built its wealth on monsoonal extraction. Its presence was still palpable in the India Office records in the British Library, in the edifices of empire on Exhibition Road, in the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and the Palm House at Kew Gardens, in the Caribbean and South Asian communities living across London's boroughs, in the city's cuisine, in the clothes we wear, in its financial commodity markets, and in the rise of India's elites to position of power in British politics. These are all legacies of the monsoon. But while colonial monsoonal legacies are a reminder of our interlinked pasts, the unfurling of neoliberal violence across monsoonal life worlds is a reminder of our interlinked futures. In fact, the companies exploiting Chennai's IT incentives are companies, you can't really see it from where you're sitting, this is a map of the IT corridor here, are companies like Amazon, Cognizant and Verizon, and Indian companies like Tata Consultancy Services, Polaris and Infosys, whose inheritor is married to the British, what do you call him? Chancellor of the Exchequer, all of which have strong ties to the UK. Acknowledging these shared histories and interconnected geographies for us offered a starting point for rethinking global collaboration, solidarity and climate justice, and for connecting climate politics in London with the climate politics of the cities we were studying. The other quite problematic map that I thought I'd pull up is a map of the red is of the biggest climate emitters, and the green is of the countries that are probably going to experience climate change most severely. And so you have the United States, China, India, Russia, the big blobs of red, and the big blobs of greeny color are Eritrea, Sudan, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so on. And so one gets this enormous sense of the kind of teleconnections, okay, between those who will be most impacted by climate change and those who are most responsible for it. It's a bit of a problematic map in other ways, but I think it makes the point. While climate adaptation, resilience, climate justice, etc., are all important stories we tell ourselves, my position is that as long as the underlying structure of society is economic growth with GDP as its measure, endeavours to reduce climate change are quite frankly doomed to failure. For economic growth is overshooting planetary boundaries at almost every level. Over the past centuries, accelerated by globalization, aspirations for plundering lifestyles have come to dominate the planet. Continuing down this path is likely to bring life on Earth as we know it to an end. Just a few statistics here. According to climate budget approaches, not that I'm terribly fond of climate budget approaches, but they make the point here. Each inhabitant of the planet should have an annual emissions quantum of below 2 tons of CO2 by 2050, if a climate protection target of 1.5 degrees is to be met. 2 tons. Today, the average balance of a US citizen is an estimated 16 tons per annum, of Germany is 9.4 tons, and the global average is 4 tons. So even if we average everything out, we're still exceeding our carbon budget by, by 200%. So, in order to have the slightest chance of staving this off, for it is not yet inevitable, I think we have to work towards bringing about radical changes in our lifestyles, our cities, and our economies, to not only reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, but to rethink our collective existence from the bottom up. And we've been discussing this over the last 2 days. I've just thrown up some books that have been quite useful for me. They're not all saying the same thing, but I think we need to start taking these theories, which might seem quite radical and extreme. I think we need to engage with them and talk about them. Okay. But to get back to the question, that Hilde started with, how do cities relate to climate change, and how can urban planning play a role in mitigation, adaptation, and systems change, in my view? So these are my concluding remarks. Okay. First of all, cities create climates. And climates, if we to go with Mike Hume, are ways of life. And here, I like to draw on race scholar Christine Sharp's term, total climate, in which the changing conditions of rainfall, drought, heat, thaw, and storm are never separable from the social, political, and cultural existence of differentiated bodies. So climate is a totality, okay, not only of weather, but of the social, political, and cultural ways that weather is mediated. It seems to me that acknowledging injustice and damage done and the impossibility of the neoliberal imperative, while also seeing the need for bodies and places to persevere. So one has to kind of acknowledge the kind of, is that my phone ringing? No, I don't think so. Acknowledge injustice and damage done, and really the impossibility of the neoliberal imperative, while also seeing the need for bodies and places to persevere. Secondly, I think what we have to do is understand cities as natural, cultural, all the way down, or up, as one might think of it. Urban planning, for me, needs to incorporate the earth and non-human agencies into its operations, not as externalities that need to be accounted for, but as active protagonists in urban world-making. And Kelly and Bruno presented this idea of a territory has its own logics. Okay, so territories make worlds, and they have certain capacities that need to be brought into urban planning. Urban planning is not only a societal, its object is not only societal. So we have to think in watersheds rather than city boundaries, thinking about green space not just for humans, but for a multiplicity of creatures. Thinking about rain not just as graphs, but as material presence in the city. Thinking about bird fly paths and insect habitats. In other words, working at a range of different scales that correspond with far bigger or smaller extents than political or human-centered boundaries. I think thinking of cities as purely those administrative boundaries, we really have to get beyond that. And I think you're doing that here. Secondly, I think we have to think about whose knowledge counts. What counts as evidence in our work? Where is it generated from? I think we need to incorporate a range of expertise, both scientific and embodied, into our activities. In my last work on Johannesburg, I ran a studio based entirely on fictional novels, and the kind of evidence of information about the city that students drew from fictional novels rather than looking at dry demographic or social science statistics was really significant. It changed their understanding of cities. Thirdly, I think we need to join the dots. In many of the cities I was working in, planning departments did not talk with the disaster management departments. There was this huge kind of, in a sense, different parts of the administration were pulling in different directions. And so I think there's a kind of real need to start to look at overlapping jurisdictions of responsibility. The second last thing, I think, that we need to think the repertoire, and I raised this afternoon, of instruments we use to tell our stories. When I set up a new research group last year at my institution, one of the members asked us at our first meeting, so what's our theme song? And it was kind of hilarious, but we suddenly thought, yeah, why don't we do things using music? You know, so I think that there's a whole kind of banal, kind of habitual repertoire of instruments and media that we use, that I think if we want to get our stories across, we need to really start investigating alternatives. Link up with artists, musicians, writers, activists in order to tell different stories and convey a different world is possible in different ways. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luciana Travassos to give a first response.
Okay, well, that's difficult, but let's do it. Well, it was so beautiful, your talk. Thank you so much. With a lot of science, poetry, and movement, which I consider very important to think about the relationship between society and climate change. So I think all the symbolisms and the images that you brought were kind of they speak for themselves, so it's very important to have these images here. The idea of thinking through land, through earth, that you brought in the first beginning, or through the monsoons maybe, has an important force to put together the dimensions of the territory that I consider essential to think about the social processes that produce and reproduce our way of being on Earth. Society, nature, economics, politics, values, images, the space itself. And when you say that the climate must be at the center of the way we interpret the city, I understand that the climate in this case, as you use and you said that at the end is a totality. It means like a metonymia of nature through which we will think through, and certainly it participates in the construction of this nature, this knowledge. So it's not just a lens, but it participates as well in the construction of this knowledge. In the construction of the new epistemologies that you highlighted so well. And I was thinking about maybe perhaps it's an ontological recovery for the construction of this new epistemology, especially if they are also built by researchers who are people and who were born in the monsoons or in the Amazon basin in these areas, because we already have this kind of problem of research concentration in Brazil, very much concentrated in Sudeste area. So we also, this is a multi-scale problem of research concentration. We are always thinking about and researching about the other, and to bring together, I think it's very beautiful to, as a position that we have to have as researchers when we are facing these questions. And as long as I understood, it's a position that you defend in your work. Certainly, this epistemology has been constructed. It's been in movement, but it's not informing our spatial plans today, although they inform some livelihoods, maybe without spatial planning, but livelihoods that are in the earth or through the nature, with the nature, as you said. It's also interesting to think about, and now I'm going to some maybe little details of your speech. It's also interesting to think about the colonial heritage that you showed there, defining the regional structure of these territories and how it's reinforced today by new or renovated structures whose functions, as you pointed out, is practically the same. So they function as the same as pipes out these countries. And I understand that one of the riches of our workshop that ends today, unfortunately, is precisely to have proposed, the workshop has proposed it as a central idea to build a multi-directional dialogue, which can inform or kind of start a construction of shared knowledge and maybe a new epistemology. A question that comes to me, and I want to ask you, is the difference between the speed of historical construction of these cultures, which were once very linked to the movements of nature, and now they need to quickly adapt to climate change, or the emergence of the climate change. In this particular and the specific, all the changes that are happening will impact their livelihoods, or yet how to build a relationship that is at the same time linked to culture to the tradition, but at the same time, dynamic enough to adapt to the uncertainties of temperature, rain, the height of the tide, that's accelerating, changing in a fast path. And this kind of cultures, they have to adapt it to it and change all the traditional culture that they had, or even in the cities that they don't have anymore. And our experience in Brazil also shows us that it's very easy to connect people with their past, even if they don't live there. Their grandpas, their grandmas, they know how the river worked at that time, even if they don't have lived this kind of life. But actually they are not anymore able to live the life that they lived before, but now they have to change it and maybe bring something from there, but also changing and moving and to adapt to this accelerating process. That's my more structural question to you, and a very punctual, detailed question about the map that you said that has something when you point out the vulnerability and emission maps of the countries. And I was thinking about why countries like India, for example, were not considered in both conditions as an emitter and a vulnerable country, because as long as I know, they will suffer a lot with climate change, especially because the water shortage in a specific way. So that's it. Thank you very much. It was a big pleasure to listen to you.
Thanks, Luciana. Shall I respond, Hilde?
Please do.
Okay, I mean, that map here, as I say, I'm quite dubious about it, and the main reason I'm dubious about it because it shows the upper part of Europe and the UK as being non-emitting and not at risk of climate change. So it's a very odd map, you know. But I think the point it makes is that there are these inequalities in the world, you know. Yeah. It's not our map. I don't even know the data that it was based on. So, you know, it really, yeah, I showed it with a great deal of or I suppose I was doubtful about showing it, but it still made the point. And you're right. I mean, India is both you know, there are these, that's why, yeah, countries are both, you know, emitters and sufferers, you know. But on your other point, I think it's it was very interesting in Tamil Nadu, if I can just talk about the area I know, and maybe some of the other students from India would like to answer your question as well. At the time that the IT corridor was set in place, and IT was made the growth engine of the province, of the state, the education system set about a process of particularly changing Dalit, poor working class rural women in the IT industry. There was a whole kind of sort of positive process of drawing, as I say, kind of very impoverished people into IT. So most of the workers in that IT corridor are formerly rural women. It was an extremely important kind of move of the state. So they haven't kind of been left behind by this neoliberal development, but their lives have changed so dramatically that apparently, I mean, I don't know this from my own research, but there's a lot of urban agriculture in Chennai now, because people still feel attached to the land and want to grow things. So I think you've identified, and you know, that when society changes so fast, like we really need to keep an eye on that and see how that changes people's identities, you know. Yeah.
Nice. Let's go to Luciana then.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. It's been actually a pleasure to meet you in person after following your work for actually, I can say, quite some even decades, going from South Africa to South and Southeast Asia. And as we've discussed, I think in the 1.5 day we've had together, I think your position, what I think is very powerful, also in a quite synthetic short presentation, is that there's a very clear position. It uses the tools of an architect, of an urbanist, to say something that challenges the world as we know it, which we know when we're facing the consequences of global warming, we're at this precipice where we have to change radically. So for me, 5 big things came up looking at the presentation. Of course, making me more curious to read the book and see also Yangon and Dhaka. But I think one is something we discussed a little bit at the last session of this workshop, which is the ridding of the binaries. And I think you made really clear that this nature-cultural construct and that climate, like landscape itself, is a a cultural construct. And I think that you make very clear, and it's something that we can spend more time on breaking down all these binaries, and the climate and weather becomes super clear. And for me, that ties very well into your notion of monsoon as method. I think what's very brilliant about this play of words is that we know the monsoon is a phenomenon, but as you say, it's also a construct. But it's, as I think you said it quite eloquently, that it's on the one hand elusive, it's very dynamic, it's somehow measurable, but it's completely unpredictable. But it's also appropriated culturally very differently, depending on which monsoon place you're speaking of, with the rituals and the storytelling. So for me, that becomes, so to understand, I think, the full impact of monsoon as method, which now too, we should all buy the book. I think it's a really, really rich metaphor in this time of, we have all the scientific models, we think, but in fact, this kind of how to plan for the unplannable, how to work with the dynamic, the elusive. I think the elusive is also very, very nice. So this, and that to me then ties directly into the creation of the stories, the creation of the narratives, tying to people like Donna Haraway and others, the stories we tell ourselves, the words we use to world. And for me, what's very particular, rather than just speaking into a theoretical cloud about this, is that the power of drawing and the mapping, the cartography, I think helps to kind of take it out of a kind of philosophical, not that I'm against philosophical discussions, but to ground it. And I think what's very bold about the cartographies is it dares to try to map the things we don't map, to try to visualize the unseen. So how to draw weather, I mean, how to draw water, how we were talking also that air is maybe left out too often in the, say, drawing of water, drawing of vegetation, soil, but also the air. So I think your cartographies, we can all, I think it's something that many of us, and I think many of our PhD students are also trying to find new ways to visualize that break also a construct of mapping, as you discussed a little bit here and informally, the kind of surveying method of the British colonialists and others. So getting away from this, somehow combining, what I think is very powerful about your maps is it somehow is combining this kind of the power of what we have now, of scientific, technological mapping, but then grounding it with field work, with material culture, and kind of the understanding that you can't have one without the other. So I think the mapping for me, and I think will be a great inspiration to to many of, not only myself, but also our students. And then for me, what I think is also very interesting in the case of Chennai, but I suppose also if we were to, I'm guessing, in Yangon, which I don't know so well, but in Dhaka, but this whole notion of the IT as the savior, also of the GDP, but also as development. I think what's interesting, well, I don't know Chennai's story so well, but hearing a little bit some stories of mutual colleagues about Bangalore, this kind of notion of the water management and tanks, and then how IT itself is also water intensive, but not stewarded in a way of a common good, but as you called it, this kind of growth engine. And I think it's something that many developing economies latch on as to the kind of golden bullet. And I think it's really nice that you point out the, say, pitfalls of this growth engine. And then for me, finally, it's something that I think is, well, this whole notion, and we've had side conversations about this notion of different ways of knowing, and these embedded knowledges, and trying to understand that as Western researchers, the stepping into other, say, in a certain neo-colonial way, to other territories, but also trying to work, as I know you have very, very strong links to your Indian and I suppose Myanmar and Bangladeshi colleagues. So I think this notion of the embedded knowledge starts to come through, also in a way of to me they all link as an alternative way of drawing, and of that the drawing the unseen becomes also a new way of knowing, beyond trying to construct from the field work and from the stories. So it's, for me, it comes together in a really interesting way, and of course the whole notion of wetness and delta, well, the land-water blurring, but the monsooners method, I think it's a really very brilliant way to also talk about it as not as a toolbox and not as a recipe, but as a method. So as a way to kind of work through, as you say, or work with this unsettled and elusive dynamic system. So for me, it's I think it's something that we can, from architecture and urbanism, it's I think very direct, but I imagine from other fields that this kind of using this metaphor of the monsoonist method is also really helpful as a way to think, so a tool to think. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Kelly. Those were very generous remarks. Thanks very much. Yeah, you know, about our drawings, I mean, I was talking a little earlier with Sugata that our maps, as you saw, are all at a very large scale. And this is one thing that we've been criticized for, okay? But that was the scale at which we could get data. I mean, these are all data-driven maps. And in fact, they all use NASA data. They use NASA data, they use a combination of data. They use NASA data, they use a kind of very messy data from PDFs of scientific papers. And they use data that we found on the ground, you know. So they're a combination, and they're not truth-telling maps. They're actually much more rhetorical maps. With the one map of the Chennai cyclone, we actually also drew into the drawing the instruments that had generated the data. So we were constantly trying to make it very clear that our drawings were rhetorical. They were asking questions. They were not kind of trying to tell the truth about environments, and that became very important for our mapping practice. However, I've now got some more research grants and I'm working back in Chennai in that coastal creek where the coal plants were actually constructed, and where we wanted to get down to much finer scale mapping, because we were criticized for the maps all being at such a huge scale, which we accept, you know. So now there's this opportunity to actually work on the ground with some very detailed toxin mapping, community mapping, and see how our techniques translate into something much more kind of impactful and usable, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I just ask, Lindsay, will the next phase of your research also be projective? Because I know you were saying that this 3-year allowed you to kind of map and understand, but is the ambition
the ambition is to now be more projective, particularly in this creek. Yeah. There is an eco-restoration plan for the creek that's being prepared by the government, okay, which of course is a sort of, you know, turn a fishing creek into somewhere where people can ride their windsurf and so on. So we're about to embark on a project to reconceptualize what restoring the creek means, which will be projective. Yeah, we'll see.
Okay. Steph. This is Steph Proost. Maybe every speaker can introduce themselves for a moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this very inspiring lecture.
Steph, can you briefly introduce yourself?
I'm from the economics professor here from Leuven. I'm interested in energy, environment, and also urban planning. Whatever. Yeah, too many things probably. But you know, in economics, it's about trade-offs. It's making choices with scarce resources. And I guess in architecture and in urban planning, you do the same thing. Now let me come back to your the choice problem. You set out for us the choice problem in Chennai. I've never visited Chennai, but I can imagine. So actually, is it not to some extent, because you know in terms of economic growth, what you need is agglomeration. You need a lot of skilled people together. You want, in a city, you want to make the city grow, and then at some point, and you want to grow it in a concentrated way. Then I say, maybe we should give up some kind of waterbeds. We should allow that some of the development is just linear. Maybe it's not optimal in terms of climate, but it may be that doing so, you just gain so much in terms of welfare and maybe also in terms of purchasing power, that you can afford a little bit more water problems that you will solve later. So that is for me the choice economics is confronted with, and probably you are confronted with. So I would like to see whether you see the same trade-off. Of course you can say, I can do everything better, and we should have done this, and we should have done that, but at a certain momentum, let's say 20, 30 years ago, you have to go, and you have to make sure that you have this development there. And I understand your concerns, but to some extent, it would be interesting to see your solution to this trade-off. I don't know that it's very clear.
No, that's very clear. I love it.
It's very simple.
I wish it were that simple. I wish it were that simple. I did quite a lot of work. In fact, I have a paper out about it on planning in Chennai. Okay, and the various plans that have been developed for the city, and in 1967, which was actually Chennai's, it was still called Madras then, Chennai's first plan for the city, and it was an absolutely brilliant plan. Okay, it developed the city in corridors from the central fort area. Look, Chennai is a city that should never have been built. Okay, it was given to the British. It was a spit of land, very unstable land on the coast, through various wheelings and dealings, was given to the British in an area that had never been settled by people of Tamil Nadu. It was impossible to build a city there. It was very clever of the ruler to give the British that piece of land and caused them terrible problems. Anyway, so you've got the city which arrived there by accident, in a way, by political expediency. And so they developed this extraordinary plan of linear corridors with leaving the water bodies and the green spaces out, because they understood that water doesn't forget and water comes back. That plan, it's an extraordinary, interesting history. That plan was usurped by a plan that was drawn up by World Bank planners. Okay. Once they discovered that all the water bodies are what are called Porombok in Tamil, that people might know that too, which means common land. Okay. So they were owned by the state. Okay. All other land in Tamil Nadu is privately owned except for the Porombok, which is common land, which is owned by the state. So in order to build housing and not have to pay an enormous amount of money to expropriate land or buy land from private land owners, they built the housing on state land. Okay, and that idea that actually you could build on land that really shouldn't be built on changed the way that land was valued in the city. Yeah, and so therefore you had this densification, compaction of the city around this kind of center, and the eradication of the water bodies. At the same time as the solution was, well, why do we need these water bodies? We can just put in drains. Okay, stormwater drains can get rid of the water, carry it to the sea. Well, that's another story all on its own, the kind of corruption around the laying of the drains. So the drains have never been laid properly, or if they're laid, they're incomplete, and the drains cause more flooding than they relieve. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a simple choice. I just think there are political decisions that slowly accrete into something which is now seen as quite irreparable, and so it's I mean, dealing with the floods is done through insurers, okay, or through disaster management, and everyone accepts it's going to flood, okay, and it was only when flooding occurred in the middle class areas, because flooding generally affects poor people, but once flooding affected the middle class suburbs on the IT corridor, then people started to take it, the government started to take it seriously. Sorry, I haven't answered your question, but I think it's a, yeah.
No, just, I think it's for everybody, it's the problem of making this difficult choice, and if we compare, let's take Amsterdam, can also be flooded, whatever. Take Antwerp, take, I don't know, our small cities. We face the same problem, but we are already rich enough to pay for it. And we made some mistakes, putting the cities at probably the wrong place, and the same also for
Yeah.
But in those countries where you have already a pool of development, maybe they can pay for them to just make sure that they use the water in a more smarter way. That they can just protect themselves against flooding, etc. They can pay for it now.
Well, not everyone.
Not everyone, but that's again a question of, not everyone, that's a question of social justice, governance within the city. Because the city, the GDP will be large enough.
But isn't that the point, Steph, that if there is choice to be made, that your story is that the choice was to make the land profitable for some and more disastrous for others?
I don't see it like profitable for some. I think there is you can make an economic development, and the economic development will in the end be prosperous for almost everybody.
Yeah,
and I know there are always the problems of people that cannot work, and there is exploitation, but all these things we also faced. And I think you can say, yeah, we still have poor people, 10% poor people, or 5% poor people, we can discuss. But there are ways but that's a matter of, it's a political choice to do. And I think if we have to say, okay, oh, we cannot do that, no, we cannot start any business, because anyway, we risk to only give to a poor rich people. No, I think that's I think the...
Well, yeah, I think you just managed to formulate neoliberalism at its core.
At its core?
Let's go to the other gentleman.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a beautiful presentation. It really resonated with me because I work in Cyprus, which shares a similar history of British colonization from 1878 to 1960 in our case, and also water precarity. And not just water precarity, that's like you said, an etic term, but it's it's a natural cultural thing. So I resonated a lot, for example, with the water management strategies. In Cyprus, terraces dot the landscape, and you talk about these tanks that manage them, the ways that people adapt and don't adapt to droughts and floods, or even to bring in the colonial side. In my grandmother's house in Cyprus, in our yard, there's a fountain on it that says ER 1952, because in the 1950s, before Cyprus gained independence, the British government implemented new water, put water fountains in the villages. So you still have these material remnants of colonialism that dot the landscape. Anyway, but I've been thinking a lot about the agency of water, and that's what I wanted to ask you to elaborate on. So specifically, you talked about water as the monsoon as the subject of world making, and I want to ask you about that. Maybe push you on that in two senses, and then at the end, you also talked about the cities as protagonists of world making. So I want to ask you about what you mean by subjects and protagonists. Are they kind of actors on a level playing field, or is there some, so one way of thinking about it, like you said, Latour, like actors, human and more than human actors just acting together on a level playing field. On the other side of things, something like what Timothy Morton talks about, hyper-objects that are so big that you can't deal with them. So the monsoon is an overwhelming force you can't deal with. So the idea of preeminence of some actors, or is it a level playing field, or what you mean by subjects is I guess the one thing. And the other side of things is on world making and making the world, which makes me think of making the earth or making the globe as synonyms. And I like how you brought out, on the one hand, the inequalities of capitalism as structuring kind of these global relations. And on the other hand, the local impacts of the monsoon. I wanted to ask you more about the one thing you said early on was about how the monsoon initiated the first transoceanic trade. So I was wondering if maybe that's an avenue to kind of bring those together, because by the end I felt a lot of that the monsoon was local and then exacerbated by these global inequalities of capitalism, but maybe the monsoon is more world making. But to kind of recapitulate, I just want to hear your thoughts more on in what sense you think water is an agent here. Is it something that is an actor alongside other actors, or something that has some kind of immense force that you just have to cope with? And on the other hand, how is it, what kind of world is created? Is it something that is, between the local and the global, something that, I hope that's articulate enough.
Okay. Let me try and answer. Let me just talk around that a little bit. You know, the monsoon is known as winds over the ocean, but the monsoon is known as rain over the land. Okay, so that transoceanic trade, which is 5,000 years old, was trade basically between the east coast of Africa and the coast of India. Okay. And it was driven by the winds. So that's why, in a sense, the winds were agents of world making, okay, in a kind of oceanic sense. But then when you get on to the land, they become, they without the monsoon, people would not exist in India. So in other words, human life is so wrapped up with this this annual rain cycle because it's known as rain over the land, okay? So it brings the water that feeds the crops, people, animals' reproductive cycles are organized around the monsoon cycle. People plant according to the monsoon cycle. One thing we just discovered actually, and this is really significant, is that in South India, in Tamil Nadu, they don't talk about the monsoon. Okay, so this was a Western construct, this idea of the monsoon. There are 6 different kinds of rain, okay, that happen at different times of the year. So there's a different conception of weather even. So I don't think we started off thinking about the monsoon as a hyper-object, but that just became such an inadequate idea to talk about this planetary force that's both global and embedded in everyday life in such intimate ways. So I don't know if
Can you say what the 6 types are?
Oh no, I can't remember the names of the 6 types of rain, I'm afraid. I don't speak Tamil yet, unfortunately. But they kind of very, and interestingly enough, in the and we got people to draw calendars a lot. I think there were a couple of images of my anthropologists drawing calendars. In the Maldives, the traditional calendar is based on 13 types of wind. Okay, so people measure their year by the type of wind. So that, and the Maldives is completely surrounded by ocean, so it's part of the Oceanic conception of the monsoon. Whereas in the south of India, there's 6 different seasons that corresponds with 6 different kinds of rain.
So the monsoon isn't really a thing that can be conceived of in these different ways. I love what you're saying. So it's a wind over the ocean and rain over the land, and over the ocean it creates a globe because it brings together 2 coasts of the Indian Ocean. But on land it's really a force to build societies.
Thanks.
Okay, I think Luciana wants to also intervene.
One question that was born in debate. You told Kelly that the next phase of your research will be more projectual, and Steph has teased you about the trade-offs. So if you can, I would like to know more details about
monsoon as a design or planning methods, not only method, but planning or design method. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? What are you thinking about?
I've only just got this research grant, Luciana, so we're still trying to figure this out. But so it's a project that's based on it's actually a sea level rise project in a way. It's working much more with the coastline, this project. Oh, and talk about the monsoon as an agent of world making. Because the currents, the monsoon currents along that east coast of India run with the coast, okay? They don't run, currents don't come at right angles to the coast there. I can't remember the word of currents that run up and down the coast. And the currents that flow north are really much stronger than the currents that flow down from the north. As soon as you put a big obstacle on that coastline, like a new port, there's a huge build-up of sediment from the south. So what that sediment build-up has done is it's sealed off the opening of the creek to the sea. Okay, so this is a very, very dynamic coastline, and what we want to start to try to do is to rethink that coastline, okay, and the impact of these obstacles on the coastline, on this kind of coastal movement, which is dramatically affecting the fishing community, and they're big fishing communities. We're talking about 25,000 families who actually live on the basis of this creek, whose livelihoods are now, it's a trade-off. They're seen as collateral damage of this new amazing port that kind of brings coal in and ships rare earths around the world. And it is a trade-off. But interestingly enough, this fishing community are providing enormously powerful resistance to these forces of globalization, and they are winning cases in court, They've closed the 2 power stations down, all right, because their fly ash is being tipped into the creek, okay, and their lives are ruined. So there is an enormously powerful, I'm not answering your question directly, so it's thinking of how the sensibilities of a fishing community and of the kind of ecologies of this creek can present a kind of viable way of thinking about the economy. How can the economy of the very poorest and the most marginalized start to play a role in the kind of reinstatement of the wetland? That's the kind of idea we're going to be working with.
My question, what dimensions that you're thinking about? Because I think that your research is very much about all these dimensions of the question and the knowledge that is created on.
Because of the power station, we often forget about the air as a material element and kind of air rights. You know, climate justice is usually associated with land or water, but what about the kind of right to clean air? Because people are dying in this creek because the pollution is so high and anyway, so it's a multi-dimensional project to kind of rethink the creek.
Yes, maybe I can answer. Oceanic is my name. I'm involved I'm a member of the board of the Leuven Institute for Advanced Studies, so welcome and thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I'm a bachelor in medicine, I'm a master in economics and business, so I try to reconcile free market entrepreneurialism with the social sciences and with the social objectives. And I felt a lot of sympathy for your concept of a development taking into account nature and in harmony with nature and environment and also the urban environment. And the idea of the target that you mentioned, that in order to fight climate change or reverse the negative consequences, we need to keep the CO2 footprint per capita in the world at 2 tons, or bring it down to 2 tons. Keep it at that low level for the countries that are there, and then of course all these countries that are way above, like the US and Europe and others, forcing them to bring it down. My question is, if we look, for example, at a country like China, which I've traveled to frequently, they of course have embraced free market entrepreneurialism over the last 30 years. It has lifted 750 million out of poverty, 750 million people out of poverty. It has increased life expectancy up to 77. In the countries that we've been talking about, India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, it hovers around 70. Poverty is much higher still. Can we ask those, or how can we ask those countries to develop harmoniously and not take the route that others have taken by first, with all the defaults and all the errors that are being made and have to be corrected afterwards, aim for economic development and lifting life expectancy and reducing poverty? How can you, what's your view on that? Can we ask, isn't there a tension between the harmonious development goal on the one hand and life expectancy and welfare, well-being indicators on the other hand? And how can we handle that for those countries that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's about taking our responsibility to reduce the level of affluence that we live with. You know, I think the people I read, and I'm not an economist, okay, so I'm probably shooting myself in the foot right now, but I think that, you know, the degrowth people I read all acknowledge that degrowth is absolutely arrogant to expect other countries to degrow, okay, while there is so much that needs to be done in those countries to to raise people out of poverty. So that's not what the argument is. But the argument is that it is our unnecessarily affluent lifestyles that we really, really have to confront and address. And that means giving up stuff, you know, and people don't do that very easily. So I at the same time, in those countries, my question probably to you is neoliberalism the only way, okay, that people can be lifted out of poverty? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think in most of the countries I'm living in, neoliberalism is increasing poverty. Okay, it's not decreasing poverty at all. It's increasing the wealth of the affluent and the very rich, but it's not trickling down, despite what we hope, at all. There is a real, inequalities is growing, and maybe my colleagues from Brazil could actually reinforce that. In my original country, South Africa, inequality is growing. It's not being reduced, okay, by the kind of extractive kind of economies that are being imposed on those countries, or those countries are adopting themselves. So I don't know, they're tricky questions, you know. Modi's corridors are not going to reduce poverty in India, that's for sure. They really are extractive arteries, okay, to take stuff out and to bring stuff in. I'm sure we could argue about this.
It's interesting to look at statistics. Huh? I would like to see the statistics where you say that inequality is growing in all these countries.
Well, I can certainly show you the statistics in Southern Africa.
Sorry?
I can show
statistics on many of these areas, and I wouldn't say it's nowhere true, but to say it's everywhere like this, I would be very careful.
I didn't say that. I said I know in my country, South Africa. And I said, looking to my Brazilian colleagues, that maybe that was the same there.
So I'm Johan Eijkmans, I'm also an economist. So I would like to follow up on neoliberalism, because you use this term frequently now, and neoliberalism is a really extreme form of liberalism that we typically associate to Reaganomics, Thatcherism, and so on. Now, my first remark is that you can hardly consider India as really neoliberal. I mean, it's opening up its markets, but it's really also controlling still a lot the economy. So I'm not sure you can call this really neoliberal. And secondly, even if the dominant model would not be neoliberalism, that is no guarantee for a development of this city in line with nature, I think. So I would like to challenge a bit the idea that neoliberalism is the root cause of the problem. Even if it were not neoliberalism, then I think still there is a lot to be done in urban planning, and it will not go automatically very well. So that is a bit where I'm stuck now, and I would like to challenge you a bit about what design principles should then be followed in any economic model that would be driving the development of an area. So.
It's kind of a big question to ask right now, and I probably... Easy question. You know, it's interesting your comment about in the 1990s, when India spoke about liberalizing its economy, you know, it had been an inward-looking, industrialized economy based on a Soviet model until that point. And, you know, the kind of mechanisms that were set in place, I think were neoliberal models, you know, opening up taking on exchange controls, opening up the market to foreign capital, encouraging private sector investment in industry. However, I think since, you know, subsequent governments, and you have the kind of, maybe my Indian colleagues can talk better to this. Since you've had the rise of Hindu nationalism when it has become a strongman state, I think things are slightly more blurred. You're right, you know. But in the impact in places like Chennai was very directly a built environment impact. Before the 1990s, there was very, very little building in Chennai. People built for their families. Apparently there were 5 builders in the city. There was very little real estate development. Suddenly, as soon as property became real estate and you could speculate on it, suddenly there was a building boom, and the kind of city was transformed and everybody wanted to build everywhere. So, I mean, it was the rise of the real estate market, okay, that really changed things in Chennai. And the real estate market obviously is not only a neoliberal thing, but it was the rise of the real estate speculator that kind of really started to change the form of the city. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about property ownership and so on, and I think that that's a key thing to look at when you're trying to think. And the other thing that got eradicated was this really, really important category of land called Porumbok, which used to be common land. Slowly over a series of kind of transformations of that idea of common land became wasteland. And as soon as it started to be called wasteland, it became wasteland, you know, and it became something that you could abuse, that you could, you know, pile your kind of rubble on. Anyway, so there's some subtle relationships with land that I think are quite key.
First, Nicole.
I hope not another economist. I hope not another economist.
Yeah, a question from me. So I'm Nicole van Lipzig. I'm a climatologist here at KU Leuven. And I would like to thank you a lot because I now will think differently when I hear the word monsoon and think about and through the monsoon. So thanks for that, and also for showing the interaction and how it shapes the environment and the real interaction that is there with the people. So the question that I have is maybe also a bit more about the prospect. So sorry for asking again a question about that, but I'm just curious if you already have some ideas about that. So what you're showing is that the resilience of the cities has been decreasing, and I think that is true for many cities in the world. So this is an interesting example, but I think it's something more common. But on the other hand, the cities are also changing in terms of population density and so on. So can you say us a little bit more about your ideas about what we should do about cities to make them more climate resilient? Is it still possible to reinstall these more traditional ways of dealing with shortage and too much water? Is it still possible to restore that, or is it not possible because the settings of the city are completely different? And how do you think that should be dealt with more maybe on a practical level?
Thanks for that question. I mean, in the context I've talked about today, ever since the 2015 floods, there has been a huge movement of restoring water bodies. Okay, so and they're across the spectrum. There's a government program, there's religious programs to restore temple tanks, because there was a realization of the really important role that even though so many have gone, that those that remained needed to be not restored aesthetically, but their hydrological their hydrological and ecological function need to be maintained. So I think there's been a wake-up call in Chennai as to the value of their traditional systems and an attempt to maintain what remains. They haven't had another big flooding year since, so it's still uncertain how much, what effect that will have. But the situation is very, very different now than it used to be. The other thing that is, I mean, in terms of our future work, is to really look, and it hasn't been done in that part of the world before, you'll be surprised, Kelly, is watershed management programs. So the creek that we're working on, it's really about understanding its whole kind of watershed, and then this relationship with the coastline, you know, so there are these gradients of wetness that need to be taken into account, yeah. I don't know if that answers, I mean, that's one little example, that there really are attempts now to rethink the city as a hydrological, not machine, but as a hydrological apparatus. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Sheba. I'm a PhD scholar here at the International Center of Urbanism. So for me, a big takeaway from this presentation was the acknowledgement of the outsider's point of view. So in terms of a Western observer first, in terms of a general researcher, but seeing the landscape or the nature objectively, as humans looking again at the nature, outside the binary of nature culture and abstracting ourselves from the nature. So, but for me, this approach of monsoon as a method, I think, is a way to confront this and to move ahead. But I also have this question from this discussion in this room that what do you think is the position of the other disciplines? And do you think one discipline in itself can go ahead and try to confront this problem of the climate change or cities? So how do you think what is the global narrative, or what is the international point of view on this, other than India?
I don't think one discipline can solve this at all. I mean, that's a simple question, and I think we need to extend the kind of, I think climate change calls on us to extend the kind of range of conversations we have with different disciplines. For instance, meteorology is never factored into planning. You know, when I spoke to the meteorologist in the Chennai Met Office and asked him if he had anything to do with the people who planned the city, he said, no, why? Why should I? So, you know, there is this huge distinction between specialist expertise, and I think we really have to work with multiple kind of expertises that we haven't brought into planning to date. And we also have to work with, I like this term, embodied knowledge rather than traditional knowledge, because traditional knowledge sort of says it's kind of old-fashioned and traditional, and now we've got to like pull it into the 21st century. Not at all. It's the knowledge that people carry in their bodies through their experience, which I think is hugely important in understanding climate change, you know, and using that knowledge as a resource to think about how we deal with it. So I think it's multidisciplinary. It's not only about experts, it's about embodied experience.
Well, I can very much agree with you on that point, and I think that's also the setup of this disciplinary work of Metaforum and Lias. At the same time, I must say that this evening confirms that in terms of epistemology and in terms of understanding what kind of knowledge we are building, all these disciplines are very far away from each other.
Right, yeah.
This is the third evening in this series. The last time it was a psychologist that was giving a presentation. For him, for example, we had a discussion about the relationship between science and politics and policies. He was very adamant. It's completely something else.
Wow.
I'm looking at the world as how it is and not as how it ought to be. Huh. Then I'm a citizen and not a scientist. So that's not how I would describe your work. But that is also embedded knowledge in the different disciplines, how we approach this. So I think for me it was very interesting, your theoretical introduction, but I think in many other disciplines this sounds like, what is she talking about?
I'm sure.
I'm sorry to say so, but that's been my experience in exchanges with the colleagues also in this kind of multidisciplinary panels. I think it's absolutely necessary, but there is still a very long way to go before we understand one another better, because it's really different discourses, different languages, different epistemologies, different understandings of, etc., etc. Okay, I just want to say that
Hilde, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, you're doing a really admirable thing here. But in my research team, we were spatial architects, landscape architects, a political scientist, and an anthropologist. Just those 4 disciplines. We had tremendous difficulty in even understanding each other's language. You know, we'd use words in a certain way and realize that actually the anthropologist understood that word very differently. So it's a real struggle. Yeah.
I'm going to return to the gentleman from Cyprus, but that will be about our last question, unless somebody urgently still wants to say something, but please.
Small comment. I mean, I totally agree with the multidisciplinarity, so to put it up front, my training was in anthropology and archaeology, and that's what I wanted to bring in relation to the neoliberalism question, because I'm very sympathetic to the argument that ties the deleterious effects of climate change to capitalism, but I think it's empirically not true, and it can be problematic for us to view it in that way. So in 2 ways, I just wanted to bring up small. One, in terms of the 20th century history of state-directed industrialization is a hugely bad economic effect. So indeed, like if it's not neoliberal, if it's run by the state, these mining extractive things, I don't think that fixes anything. And 2, on the side of the commons and the embedded knowledge and the tradition, I absolutely agree that like restoring wetlands is very important. Like I said, in Cyprus, the traditional water management strategies are important. But I also know in Cyprus that the tradition was to graze sheep and goats all over the island, and that led to massive deforestation. And if you look at the paleobotanical record, it's clear that when humans started agriculture, the environment degraded greatly. And as probably many people know, in general, all over the world, including in indigenous societies, in the paleobotanical record shows that the environment is degraded by human habitation. Anyway, my point is just that the degradation, I don't think, can be identified with capitalism. It has to be sought somewhere else. I don't know where else, but as much as I'm sympathetic to it, I think it's important to be, because I don't think this, I would love to say that if we change the models of economics, we solve climate change, but I'm worried that it's much deeper.
Okay, no very urgent questions anymore. Then I think we are left with thanking you again for a wonderful lecture and for animating such an interesting discussion. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Hilde.